Welcome to Casual Watch Talk, the podcast from the Casual Watch Reviewer YouTube channel. Join us as we talk everything watches, from watch collecting, the latest horology news and interviews. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe on your favourite podcast app. Let's dive into the show. Hi everyone, welcome to episode 46 of Casual Watch Talk. Today, Chris and I are joined by a very special guest, Dean from Little Switzerland, which is a watch store based in St. Thomas. So in fact, it's a chain of watch stores. I think this is going to be a really interesting interview, especially with everything that's been going on in 2020. Dean's got extensive knowledge of a multitude of brands, and I'm certainly interested to find out which brands have been doing well during this time. So, Dean, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And this was, we have to give a shout out to Todd, who's a member of our Facebook group, joined us on multiple episodes before. So, Todd, thanks for joining us and for making the introduction.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
As always, we'd love to start the interviews with learning a bit about your background. How did you get into watches? Have you always been into watches, or?
Yeah, it's funny. If you would have told me 30 years ago that this is what I would have been doing, I probably would have laughed in your face. I was raised in the New York area, in Jersey predominantly, and my wife is from the Virgin Islands, and we came back here after getting married. And though my undergraduate was in music, and I had worked in studios in New York, I came down here realizing that there wouldn't be anything like that industry here. And so for the first few weeks, I just sort of got to know the island. And then one day walked into a jewelry store and saw expensive price plugs, and had done some sales while in college, to help pay the bills, working at Eddie Bauer at night and things like that. And realized that I enjoyed people, I enjoyed helping people. And so I just told them, do you need anybody who's halfway decent at what they do? And the manager kind of looked at me cockeyed and said, "Sure, come on in." And it was actually off season, which was an interesting thing. It was May 26th of '94, and they were in the off season, and it's like the slowest month. And they threw me into watches, and I one by one read every book I could get my hands on of each brand at that time that we carried. And then I began reading up on other brands. And my dad was in sales pretty much all of his life, and he said, you need to know your product like the back of your hand, and then after that, you need to know your competitors' products. But don't learn your competitors until you know yours. Yep. And so I took that sage advice and read everything I could find. And there wasn't really any internet presence at that time for watches. Watch Time wasn't even around yet. I think International Wristwatch might have been up and coming at that time, but there just wasn't a lot to get your hands on. So I just read every master catalog that came with every brand we carried. After being in the business about 3 years, I took a little time off to do some work for our church, and then I came back after about 2.5 years. And at that time, then there was Watch Time, there were other magazines, HR and all that, and I ended up coming back and selling again, and I ended up doing some journalism for the industry as well, because I would read some of these things in International Wristwatch or Watch Time, and I would read things and think that's not accurate. And, not trying to be arrogant or anything like that, just realizing that I'd read enough stuff that I knew that some of these things were either just a misguided opinion, or they just weren't true or weren't accurate. And so I started doing some journalism myself, contributing to magazines like Revolution USA, to HR, which was based in Florida, and a few others. And that was kind of a fun sideline. Interestingly enough, of course, for me and my business, ended up giving me quite a bit of credibility among the people that I would meet and talk to, and people would refer others to me. This guy's a journalist too. You got to listen. And I tried to play it very humbly because I was like, look, the more like anyone who's really into educating themselves, I knew that the more that I learned, the more I realized how little I knew.
Mm-hmm.
And I still feel that way. And I'll spend my first. We just reopened our stores now after being closed for 7 months, and we only opened up a couple of our stores. We have 34 throughout the Caribbean, and we've got maybe 7 or 8 stores open. So we're being very careful, short hours, short days. I usually spend my first hour and a half reading anything I can get my hands on. I tend to frequent the Purist Pro. I tend to frequent Hodinkee, Revolution out of Singapore, and I'll read everything I can, just because there's always something new coming out. And right now the industry is in a challenging position because unless you have something super desirable, people are going to kind of wait. And my what I've seen over the last few weeks that we've been open is that I stay in touch with all my clients. It used to be email, and now it's texting. And I've got people asking me for key models. Everybody wants the silver Snoopy. Everybody wants a 5711. A lot of people want the new master calendar from Jaeger. There's a lot of really great product that has launched in the last 4 to 6 months, and people could travel. We have a lot of St. Thomas is the number one cruise port destination in the Caribbean. And so we have a lot of people who just come here as a shopping destination, and they'll come to town, shop, tell the kids to stay at bay for now. Daddy's going to buy something, and then they'll take them all to the beach after that, And but people haven't been able to travel. So what we're finding is that people got a lot of money in their pockets, and they haven't spent it on a trip, and so they've got a little extra money. And so they're willing to stretch it. If the budget was 6 to 10,000, now they're thinking, man, maybe I'll do 12 or 14 or 15. So and we will mail to the States and all that, but we're seeing a lot of people looking for the same products. I mean, there are the run of the mill stuff is pretty dead in the water.
I think the perception, sort of, Chris and I have talked about this, and I was getting this perception from Watch Pro, and certainly looking at the share prices on the Swiss stock exchange. It seemed like the premium brands seem to be doing well, but the mid-range ones seem to be really suffering. LVMH stuff, which is Tag, Omega was stumbling as well during the pandemic, it seemed like, before the Silver Snoopy was released. I'm interested to get your perspective on that. Is that what you're seeing? Is the higher end stuff, are people really looking for value in a world that's quite turbulent?
Well, I think there are at least, I don't want to limit myself, but there are probably two main clients that I have. And I have people who come who have no idea that St. Thomas is a shopping mecca for people all over the world. Because, with some brands, it's not about the price, it's about the availability.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Oh, sir, I thought you wanted this. What are you trying to ask me about what the best price is for? I thought you said you wanted this 5711.
Yeah,
So
nice.
there's certain things that are about availability, not about price. But I frequently, when customers come to me, I assume that they think they know what they want, but can most often be persuaded to look into something else. Like I have guys who've been, looking at advertisements, or a friend of theirs has something, and maybe it's not a model, maybe it's a brand. The Caribbean has done very, very well with Breitling. It's been probably for the last 15 years, it's been the number one revenue brand. It's done really great. And I know other markets haven't done as well, but we've done really great with it. And, we have seen recently quite a drop since the pandemic. Like they haven't really put out anything exciting. George's Kern has taken over, and he's still trying to, I think, sort of find his way through there. But when people come to me, they'll say, I've heard this is the place to buy, and I really want a nice watch, and I'll ask them a couple of 20 question things like, what's your budget, and do you want a strap or a bracelet, and what color do you want, like a steel, like a white metal, or a rose, or a yellow, you want plated or solid. And then one of the main questions I'll ask him is, all right, let me ask you this. Who are you buying this watch for? And let's say, well, I'm buying it for me. I said, are you sure? Because if you're buying it for your buddies and for bragging rights, Rolex and Patek. If you're buying it for yourself, I have a lot of great brands to show you. I love Carla Fucher. I love Jaeger. There's a lot of really great brands out there, but I like to try and figure out who are they really buying this for? Because the attitude for some people, you show them a brand that they never heard of, and they're like, "What, 10 grand? For that, I'll buy a Rolex." Is the sort of usually the response, because they're thinking bragging rights. If I'm going to spend that kind of money, I want other people to know I spent that kind of money. So I try to kind of feel them out, kind of guess where they're at and all that. And this is more now non-COVID talk, but since COVID, I will tell you, there is a very good problem that has developed among a number of smart brands. I think with Rolex, even though no one knows exactly the figures, they can be, we know this, between 800,000 and 1.2 million, depending on how good a year it is.
Right.
Annually. Patek and Jaeger, they're both around about 60,000 pieces a year right now. Thierry Stern has said as much. The Richemont Group, they did their virtual SIHH this year, and there was some great product launch. And then Patek and Rolex were like, "Yeah, we're not going to launch anything." And then, lo and behold, of course, they quietly launched some stuff. But there's been so much of a fever to buy. People have been sitting home on their computers with plenty of time to just, especially if they have split screens. I know guys who are Wall Street traders, and they got stocks on one side and they're looking at, Purist Pro on the other side, or Hodinkee or something. And these guys, that I joke. I always tell my friends, I don't keep catalogs around the house. I used to get catalogs. Catalogs make you want to shop.
Right. That's right.
But when you've got a screen up of Hodinkee or something like that, or the Rolex website or the Patek website or whatever it might be, you start convincing yourself that you need these things.
Yeah. And you feel like, do you feel like some of your more of your customers are sort of coming in as connoisseur, asking those connoisseur questions, asking those more to the watch appreciator side than maybe, like you said, for someone else, buying a watch for show for someone else?
It depends on the brand. I do believe in general we're starting to see people develop a little more of a connoisseur's taste, that it's something for them. It's something that they gravitate towards. It speaks to them rather than it speaks to all my buddies. And since it's so hard to have, I got to have one.
Yeah.
That seems to be like, now that Rolex changed the sub and all that, everyone's, oh yeah, I bought a Hulk, and the next day it was worth 3 times as much. And my buddies all want to say, and that's not my taste. I'll just say this up front. I have a world of respect for Rolex as a brand and how Hans Wilsdorf built his brand. It's not my brand. I prefer to be a little bit under the radar. I'd rather people look at my wrist and kind of wink and say, like, nice taste, and that's the end of it. So that's sort of my personality, I guess.
Nice.
But I have tons of guys asking me for these pieces that are the super desirables, if you will. It used to be, I think in the late 90s, it used to be that the average European would have 5 to 10 watches, and the average American would have 1 to 3 watches. And the average Americans weren't very well educated, and it was more about whatever their friends said, or maybe a mentor, their boss, what somebody said. Europeans would come in; they were always asking for what we would consider the obscure brands. And I think the internet, particularly some of the online sites like Hodinkee and others, Time Zone has become, I think, a little bit almost too pedestrian. even though it's the largest site still, but it's become, everyone goes there who's sort of a novice.
Mm.
But I think, brands, I think websites like the Purist, which used to be Purist, which is now Purist Pro, or Watch Pro site, right? It used to be Purist Pro. I've always felt like they were more in depth than most of the other sites. So that was always where I gravitate towards. And if you go to Purist Pro and you look for Watch Me, you'll find me. I tend to lurk quite a bit on Jaeger and Paddock and those sites because I tend to like the handmaids. But the Americans have been getting better educated. And so they're becoming a little more connoisseurs. And I think they get to a point where sometimes they get to the point where they realize, man, I've got 5 Rolexes and 3 Omegas and 2 Breitlings, and what else is out there? And then they start really looking for them. And we're starting to see that more now.
Yeah, I wonder if that goes back to sort of turn of the century, where America was a powerhouse of watchmaking, but it was those middle brands, wasn't it? Like Hamilton and Elgin and all the others that ended up dying the death, but they were very much the working man's watch at the time.
Right, every man's watch. Yeah.
Every man's watch, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the American watch industry had a great history, and from Waltham, Elgin, all those, and Hamilton was honestly probably the most creative of all of them, because you look at their catalogs of all their case designs. Hamilton had this just unrelenting. They just were nonstop creativity. But they were, and it's funny now. You look back at the catalogs, and these watches were $50.
Right.
I mean, I look at a 1968, 69 catalog, and I see an advertisement. Like I've got an old Life magazine with the Beatles in it on the cover, and in it you'll see watches like Le Coultre and Company that were $150.
Yeah.
Hindsight being 2020, I wish I could take a time machine and go back and buy a few memo boxes and bring them back to the future. But yeah, things have changed so much in the production, the dynamics, and all that. I was having a conversation with Todd. I had read recently, maybe 6 months ago, about Zenith, who I've always loved. And Zenith, right now I think they make somewhere around 17 or 18 or 20,000 watches a year. But in 1970, they were making like 410,000 watches a year. I had no idea of the volume that they had. Now, they were $120. So they've got some of the same revenue in a much higher ticket and much lower production. But it's interesting that the volume before the quartz crisis of what these brands were doing is just, there are exceptions, of course, Paddock and other brands that were much lower AP, that were much lower production. But yeah, I mean, there's, Hamilton, these brands, they did an everyman watch type of thing. And I think that now we're seeing people, I mean, I tell people, look, if you need to know the time, I've got the modern day pocket watch right here. My iPhone is really, if I need accuracy, I've got that. And people are beginning to realize they want something a little more special, a little more unique, especially after they've gone through the run of like sort of the big 3, if you will.
I was talking to somebody about the quartz crisis at work today, and I tried to explain it by saying it was sort of like when the iPhone came out in 2007. All the other phone makers completely big time underestimated that the iPhone was going to dominate. And then as soon as the iPhone came out, a lot of those brands like Nokia was decimated, and a lot of the other sort of brands fell away, like Alcatel and all of those that were Ericsson and all of them that was making phones. They no longer exist really. And I imagine that's how the quartz crisis was, where they were kind of poo-pooing quartz for a while, and then a few of them sort of dabbled with quartz, like BlackBerry dabbled with touchscreen, but nobody could really pull it off. So, but it's good to see that there's a lot of micro brands, US micro brands coming back out now. We interview a lot on the channel, Chris and I. So there's a new excitement about US watchmaking.
Yeah, and I think that the US watchmaking, I mean, forgetting his name is Michael, is it Cole out of Pittsburgh? Forget his name now, but he was doing like 2,500 watches a year. RGM is doing some really great stuff out of Lancaster and getting some of his own movements. And of course, the goal is to have, movements and cases. I think it'll be a long time before we have crystals made in the US. Yeah. I mean, Commodore pretty much dominates Switzerland as the main crystal maker, and that's a real specialty. But But I think, we'll see more coming into the U.S. I think the micro niche brands that have started humbly. There's a company out of Brooklyn right now that you can kind of customize the strap and the case and all that. It's nothing special. Sometimes it's a quartz movement.
Yeah.
Even whatchamacallit that's out of Detroit now.
Shinola. No.
Shinola. They've got this stamping of built in Detroit, but they're really using random movements that they're reassembling.
Right.
So, I mean, they've got to be able to get past that if they want to have more credibility. At the moment, it's fine. They're good-looking cases, but it's a fashion brand.
Yeah, I think that Shinola's actually done a bit of a damage to US watchmaking, because there's some great, like you said, there's some great watchmakers. You've got Cameron Weiss over in LA that's building most of the movements himself. I was chatting to a microbrand, Zao Baltimore, and he was saying, it was funny you mentioned about the crystals. He was saying that's hard, but apparently getting a hairspring made in the US is impossible.
It's impossible right now.
Yeah.
No one does assortments right now. I mean, you pretty much have to call Nivarex in order to get something of an assortment in the U.S. right now. I think that could change, but you have to have somebody with the capital who's willing to invest. To start small, invest, and become basically a monopoly for the U.S. the way that Swatch Group has. Because, I mean, who's going to make that kind of investment? And then you have to have the demand. I mean, if you're going to, like a lot of brands have done, if you're just going to get an ETA movement that's a kit, then you're going to get their assortment also. Why would you bother switching out a different assortment?
Right.
I mean, the money is not in the assortment. The money's in the rotor and everything else.
Yes.
Right, in the bridges. So
yeah.
Unless somebody can go do an A to Z, which I can't see. I don't think there's any, unless there's somebody who is a billionaire who's trying to figure out what should I do with my money. You can convince somebody like that, but anybody who's really starting from scratch, I don't see how they can have the money and the investment it's going to take and the perseverance it's going to take to be able to shop that around and be able to say, hey, I am the source, because, those assortments have to be proven too.
Absolutely.
There's very few brands that make their own. I mean, Jaeger makes their own, but they've been doing it for, almost 200 years.
Yeah, and put on the watchmaker bench and run in someone's wrist for 10 years and fixed and repaired, and we know what this part does and this. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about when Patek or Jaeger or AP or Vacheron, one of these guys comes out with a new watch or a new movement, they'll usually say things like, well, the failure rate is about 1 or 2%. And I didn't know exactly what that meant at first. And then they're saying, no, we expect 1 or 2% of our watches to come back. And they think that's a really great low number, unless you're one of the people who's 1 or 2%.
Right. Yeah.
1 out of every 100 watches.
And it's interesting that it feels like the internet could change that too, because we see that with a lot of brands where the loudest commenter rises to the top of the internet. And so, you say like only 1%. I mean, I hear this with Seiko, where, with their QC stuff, and a lot of people are like, well, yeah, 100 people complained, but they made 1 million watches. So you're like, that's not really bad, guys. Like, that's not a problem. But at the same time, they're sort of fighting that PR that, that like, oh, this is supposed to just, and I can certainly imagine with that clientele, they're just like, I paid what for this? This just needs to be absolutely, pristine, perfect work. So interesting.
Tagging along that, you think about somebody who buys a 911. We joke, sir, like Little Swisson has this thing we offer on some of our brands, okay, like Omega. Omega's a 5-year guarantee, and we offer a free 2-year extension. Now, in that 2-year extension, we do the work, but I explain that the first 5 years, the brand, if there's something that happens under the first 5 years, don't call us, you call Omega, because the brand wants to find out, is this a user issue or a factory issue? If it's a factory issue, they want to fix it. After that, we can do it. People are like, well, why would I bother with an extended warranty? I mean, it's this, I'm paying $10,000 or $8,000, whatever, for this Aquaterra, whatever, this Seamaster, this Planet Ocean. And I'll ask them, well, what kind of car do you drive? Well, I drive a 911. Did you get an extended warranty? Yeah. Why? Because it's a mechanical device. It's going to have problems.
Yeah.
There's always a chance that something happens in a mechanical device. And interestingly, after like 28 years in the business now, one of the things people ask me about, for example, how often should I service this watch? How often should I lubricate this watch? And I'll tell them, I've got a couple of rules of thumb, and my rules of thumb have changed over time as I've been around in the business longer. I used to be, well, these guys recommend 3 to 5 years, and then it was these guys recommend 4 to 6 years because the lubricants got better. But as I've been around longer and heard more stories of people who sent them off religiously and got them back and they didn't run the same way, I've sort of fallen into, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, unless you take it in the water a lot.
Right.
If you take it in the water a lot, you want to have it pressure tested, and that's a different ball of wax. But if you've got a watch that's really running well, you can sell 9 Navitimers, the same model, and they're going to come back at different times. Every piece, because the way the person wears it, or if how abusive he is. I mean, every piece is going to be different. So
I'm really interested to ask you about some of the brands, because I know you're an expert on quite a few brands. One that I've not had much experience with, but it was funny that you mentioned Hamilton, because Hamilton's so famous in films. But one of my favourite films recently was the John Wick franchise, and that's where the Carl F. Bucaro watches really came into their own. I mean, the final fight scene of John Wick 3, where it's essentially a billboard of the watch playing behind was amazing as a watch geek. But I know they own Tonneau, I think, but it's a brand that I don't know a lot about. Is it new or?
So that's a great question. The short history, and it's actually an important history, is that Carl Friedrich Bucherer basically decided to open a jewelry store in Lucerne, which was the vacation capital for Switzerland, in 1880. So it's 1888. In the 20th century, his sons, he was a jeweler, and he had just this little shop inside of this, just like one room inside of this hotel, right? You walk into the hotel, and on the left-hand side was the registration, and on the right-hand side was his little jewelry shop that was probably, 20 by 30 feet. In the 20th century, his sons became watchmakers, and they started to carry pocket watches. And Hans Wilsdorf, when he was getting ready to launch Hans Wilsdorf and Davis, came to Carl F. Bucherer's workshop and said, "Hey, listen, I'm starting." He was in England at the time. He said, "I'm starting this wristwatch brand. This brand will be dedicated to wristwatches, not pocket watches. And I'm wondering," basically, he said, in essence, "could I get 3 feet of space? Just on memo kind of thing." And he was like, "Yeah, sure. Why not try it out?" Right. Well, they started selling, largely to women first, because men were still doing pocket watches. Really,
right.
Even after World War I, it was still 50-50. After World War II, it was pretty much dead, right? And really, honestly, the military is what, catapulted the wristwatches. But so, 1905, they start carrying Hans Wilsdorf and Davis. And 1908, they came up with the name Rolex. And as I'm sure you know the story, and your listeners know that, Hans Wilsdorf created the name because he wanted a name you pronounce the same in every language. You go to Germany, it's Rolex. You go to Italy, it's Rolex. Whereas Timex would be Timex. He wanted something that's pronounced the same in every language. And they started stamping some of the dials, and they started writing to some of their clients, "Could we take that watch back and put this name on it?" And a lot of people said no, jumping late. But they started more and more getting them on. And by 1920 or 21 or something like that, all the dials said Rolex. When I tell people the story now, they're like, "Oh my gosh, why wouldn't people?" No one knew who they were. Maria Gleitz had not swum across the English Channel yet. None of that was done yet. I mean, it took them a while to build it up. But Hans Wilsdorf and Carl Friedrich Bucherer became super, super close friends. In 1919, Carl decided, you know what, this watch thing is really taking off. I think I'll add my own collection. And like a lot of people, he had collections, stamped with his name on it. And it wasn't until, in-house didn't really become sexy until like the 80s and the 90s.
Right.
Most people didn't make their own watches, right? They got a design from one person and someone else built it. And they said, "Yeah, don't forget to put our name on it and send it to this address." But they started doing their own watches in 1919, and they only sold them in their stores. However, the thing about it was that GIs from the US and people who visited Switzerland would go into this Bucherer store, which Bucherer then began to expand around Switzerland. They were still in Lucerne. And interestingly enough, that little shop where they had their one little room off of the registration for the hotel, they now own that whole building. That building is now the Bucher flagship store, and a pretty amazing place. I got to tour that with some Ron Stahl, who runs the brand, has become a very good friend of mine, and we went to Switzerland back in '09 and had this great tour. But anyway, as they expanded around, the Rolex and the Carl F. Bucher brands at that time just said Bucher. The Bucher brand went with them. And guys from the U.S. would come and they'd buy things and take them back to their families and say, "Hey, I got you this thing, this watch that you can only get in Switzerland." And they weren't expensive. I mean, they were it was like Tissot quality, right? Tissot, you can't fault them. I mean, it's good quality. If you don't want a lot of bragging rights, you're gonna get it. You're gonna get the same quality as well in a lot of other brands for a quarter of the price. And that's what it was like. But in 1999, the grandson Jorg decided he wanted to go upmarket. He said, basically, the quartz crisis is over. And interestingly enough, by the way, Bucher had been involved in funding the Beta 21 project, along with Patek and Jaeger and a bunch of other brands. So they were fully invested in the Swiss industry. But he said, I want to go international. I want to do two things. Three things. I want to reposition the brand. I want to honor Grandpa. Hence, instead of just saying Bucher, now he put Carl F. Bucher on the dial. And he said, number three, I don't want to make more than 30,000 watches in any given year. Now, keep in mind, they are the largest Rolex dealer in the world. And their mentality was, we understand volume. So they started off in, I think, '02, they started getting some of the watches out in Switzerland. Then they were looking for people to represent them in different regions around the world. Ron Stahl, who has his own company, Stoll Incorporated, which is one of the largest after-sales companies in the U.S., after-sales service companies, kept on getting requests to repair some of these watches. And he said, why don't you let me bring your brand to the U.S.? And he's like, yeah, give us a couple of years. We're getting ready to launch in the U.S. And so he got the contract, and our company got it in '03, which we were the third door at that time to get them. To answer your question, the brand technically as a watch brand has been around since 1919. The company since 1888. But let me tell you, as a jewelry store that has been very successful in Switzerland, they bought a competitor in Germany. I don't remember the name of the brand of the competitor, but they had 40 stores in Germany. In Europe, Bucher is the largest watch retailer. In 2017, in December, they bought the Tourneau franchise. Yeah. And part of the reason they bought them was because, Tourneau had already passed hands a couple of times. And they were basically in Chapter 11. And Ron Stahl mentioned to Jorg Bucher, hey, I hear these guys are for sale. If you own Rolex and you have a jewelry store and you want to sell your jewelry store, Rolex AG will not allow you to sell to just anybody. They have to vet who's buying it.
Interesting.
And since they are, Bucher is the number one Rolex dealer in the world.
It's like a pre-lit decision there.
Well, what happened was he Jorg said, let me reach out to my contacts at Rolex. And the story I heard was that he called whoever was running the show at that point. It was before Dufour got there, I think, or right after Dufour got there. And he said, I hear that Tourneau's for sale. And they were like, yeah, we were going to call you. And they told him, this is how much it's going to be, whatever, 40 million or 50 million, whatever it went for at the time. And Jorg Bucher is one of Switzerland's 50 richest men. And he bought Tourneau for cash.
All right.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, and Todd and I were having this conversation the other day. That is one of the reasons why the Carl F. Bucher brand, Jorg's attitude has been, we're going to be successful because success takes time and money. I don't have a lot of time, but like my friend Hans Wilsdorf, I have set up a trust because he doesn't have any heirs. I've set up a trust and I've got plenty of money. We will be successful over time. So, they've done great, and they've started releasing their own movements back in '08 with the A1000 peripheral rotor. And they've kind of focused on the peripheral rotors, which I think is kind of cool. And then they've done some really great proprietary movements. where they their travel tech, for example. It was a module that's mounted on an ETA 2892 because the 2892 has so much torque. It can move a lot of things. But the module was something they developed with their own company. They bought THA, which was originally founded by FP Journe, and they have really done some great things. And they only do generic movements if it's like a time only piece, at their lower end. Most of their stuff is going to be built with Dubois de Pras or THA. And they really focus on specialized stuff. And so, for me, people come to my store, and if a guy wants a Breitling or Omega or tag, I'm going to sell it to them. But if they come to me and say, "God, I've got 5 Breitlings already and 2 Omegas, what else should I look at?" And I'll say, "Well, if you like that quality, let me show you something special."
It's interesting. We had a pod about maybe about a couple of months ago. We were talking about Swiss brands that sort of came out of nowhere in the U.S. market. Swiss brands that sort of no one knew about, but yet have been around since 1840 or whatever. And I think that's it's definitely one that's on the list. And from just a marketing standpoint, it sort of feels like, these who is this brand? Where do they? Oh, they say they're around from 1888, et cetera. And I think sometimes we get a lot of marketing where you have this company that buys this old brand that used to make dive watches in the 60s and they re-up it, etc. But here's a great story of a brand that came from the beginnings of Rolex that you wouldn't necessarily know about coming over in the States. Fascinating story.
Yeah, and people ask me, I'll mention the name. Oh, I've never heard of it, and I'll tell them, listen, quite frankly, this is the company that basically made Rolex who they are. Now, obviously, Rolex's marketing is what made them who they are.
Right.
But as a retailer, they really did make them who they are. I was astounded when I went to visit their flagship store. Todd and I were talking about this the other day. The gentleman who runs their flagship store, told us, being a group, that they get 2 Rolex shipments per day.
Wow.
And I asked him, I said, do you guys do like $100 million a year? And he kind of leaned up on his toes and said, if I did $100 million a year in the store, I would get fired.
Wow.
So wow. The amount of revenue they do in Rolex is insane. But here's the thing: before, they were doing they were doing a fairly good amount of advertising in the U.S. Now that they own Tourneau is the advertising.
Right. It's popping up everywhere for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody who we hired who used to run a Tourneau store, and he told me that when a client comes into a Tourneau store, regardless of what brand they ask for, they are required to introduce the brand, the house brand. So it's not like they have to do it in print. Everybody who comes in is going to start hearing about this brand. Now, eventually, they may get more print, of course, but everybody has to learn if they walk into a Tourneau. And Tourneau is still the largest retailer in the U.S.
Yeah, I could attest to that. I've been in a Tourneau, and they've been talking to me about that brand.
Yeah, they did it. They did it at our local one. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I know that we're going to get comments about if we don't ask, and I don't know how much you can say about it, but certainly last year with this perceived sort of constriction of the supply of Rolex, and it was believed that Rolex were constricting the supply. It really hits home because we used to regularly go to Las Vegas because we can drive from here, my wife and a few of the neighbors, and I started seeing like Tourneau, them having less and less Rolexes in the window, and then the Rolex dedicated AD in Caesar's Palace shut down completely. It was boarded up and everything, and I was like, wow, what's going on here where even their own ADs are unable to get supplies? And we asked in the one in the Bellagio and in Tourneau, and Rolex could really just pump the supply back up and save a lot of these resellers that have been really struggling during the pandemic. I don't know whether that's like a misconception on my part or...
I can speak from an opinion. I'm not sure if I can speak authoritatively. okay, in the time that I've been in the business, when I got in the business, Rolex was at a very different place. In the 80s, Rolex had lost control of their market. People were deep discounting the brand all over the place. When I got in the business in 94, Rolex was through litigation shutting down like 400 US retailers.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Through litigation. And it made everyone else just sort of sit up like, I don't need to get into a litigation with Rolex. So people started backing off on their, on their discount. Like, okay, Rolex, we say it's a free market economy in the United States. We can't tell you what to sell it for. And Rolex, their attitude was like, oh, no, we're not telling you what to sell it for. Here's the retail, and here's 10% off. You can sell it for anywhere you want between there. From 1 to 9, you're fine. We're not telling you what to sell it for.
Like
Right.
Apple.
But everyone knew, if you go beyond that, unless you can prove that it's like friends and family, you better watch out.
I get a phone call.
Yeah, exactly. And I think now what's happened is they've begun to realize, look, we can reel in and make almost all of our watches super desirable now. We can basically get all of our retailers to go to a zero discount, at least in the short term. Because the brands, let's be honest, the structure of the wholesale to retail for the margins, the brands want you to sell at retail. In America, there's only a few pieces that can normally command that. But both Patek and Rolex now, we've seen more and more and more pieces that can command that. So, you can restrict the supply, and then all of a sudden, an Air King is hard to get. Now you see these new yellow dials and these red dials that all of a sudden, with these oysters, people want these new dials, and they're being smart and they're releasing a little bit at a time. It's a law of economics, and they're being smart about how much they're going to release and who's going to get them. And they know, because a lot of the brands that are well respected do secret shop their retailers. And then they kind of know who's not treating them properly. Cartier about 6 or 7 years ago shut down a third of the U.S. retailers, and then they jacked up their wholesale.
Wow.
They left the retail the same, but they jacked their wholesale. It used to be 10, 15 years ago, if you came for Cartier, you got 20%, 25%, no problem. Now, 4, 5, 7, maybe 10. Because if you try to sell at the same margin, you don't make any money anymore.
Interesting.
And so for example, the other Richemont brands have done that. My CEO, when I love Jaeger LeCoultre very much, and then he'll say to me, yeah, but you don't understand, they're our worst margin brand. And he's an accountant. He's all about the margin. But with Cartier and with Jaeger, brands like that, there's very little margin in it. And so that's why a lot of these brands have gone more to a boutique scheme, because then they can justify, the retail and not having a lot of discount, which, as you know, Omega their plan is to go all boutique in the United States. Yeah, they haven't gotten there yet, but that's their plan.
So it's interesting you mentioned about the Snoopy, because I thought that was going to be boutique only. Oh, but you own boutiques as well.
We do. We have at the moment 4 boutiques, but I will tell you, they force a lot of retailers to open boutique style shop and shops, but they don't treat them like boutiques.
Yeah.
For example, we have Breitling and Tag Heuer boutiques, and they treat us like boutiques. When a special limited boutique only piece comes out, we get it right away. Omega, we ask for pieces. The Snoopy that came out 3 years ago, or was it 4 years ago now? That's doing 25 to 30,000 right now in the secondary. It originally sold for like $7,200. We never even got it. And Omega I think they realized 2 years ago when they did that Speedy Tuesday, and they sold 2,000 limited edition pieces in 20 minutes.
Yep.
I think Omega suddenly was like, why in the world are we opening up these pieces to retailers? I spoke to a customer of mine who was offered one of the silver Snoopies, and he was offered it from a boutique, and the boutique manager told him that he was told every Omega owned boutique will get 55 Snoopies per year. It's not limited edition, but they're treating it like a Daytona. It's, the highest value clients get it first. Yeah. And so, it does leave us and other retailers in a little bit of a quandary, because on one hand, You want to say, look, we're standing by you. If you give us this Snoopy, we're not going to discount it. We understand it's a hard to get piece. Okay. But their attitude is, but if we sell it to you at wholesale, we make a certain amount. But if we sell it at retail, we make a lot of money. And in the pandemic, when things were shut down, I think my attitude is, I think that they're thinking, why should we bother selling stuff to retailers when we can make all the money ourselves and make up for what we have lost over the last 6 months?
And then have to deal with all the drama of distribution. Have fun with that.
Yeah, exactly. And they can track everything much more accurately. Who got what piece? They can have their own boutiques fill out a reader card, mail it in that this gentleman, like Paddock registers every piece. They can register every single piece they're doing now of the hard to get pieces. Now, at the moment, honestly, Omega doesn't have a lot of hard to get pieces. I was not that enamored by the latest James Bond piece. I didn't think it was all that.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, it didn't. I mean, the mesh bracelet doesn't do much for me in any brand, because mesh bracelets to me don't have identity. It's not, the pilot bracelet in Breitling, it's got the angled link, it's a Breitling, but the mesh bracelets don't do anything. And I thought that the James Bond on the NATO strap looked pretty cool, and it was titanium. But honestly, I felt like the design was, let's see what else they come out with.
Yeah, it's amazing that they came out with that titanium case to great fanfare, but even Citizen does spectacular titanium cases. I don't think and it was double the price of a normal Seamaster, and that the old radium was done well heavy-handed. I'm not sure what they were doing with that at all, really. It's a shame, because it would have been a good-looking watch if they just toned it down a little bit, but the price was like spectacular.
Well, yeah, I think some of the brands, they want to please the market, but I think some of them rush to market and cut some corners. Like, I think we can all agree that the first round, especially the plain dial of the AP code 1159, was just, it should have been flushed down the toilet. I mean, they came to market with the white dial, and I was like, gorgeous case. What were they thinking on the dial?
Yeah.
Except for the perpetual with the lapis dial, that was beautiful. Everything else, I just thought, man, you've got the most beautiful case I've ever seen. And it looks like the dial was like an afterthought.
Kind of staying on the same topic where Omega controls, sort of the marketing, the Rolex marketing and sales, the retail pricing, things like that. We've had several discussions about Breitling, and I think Breitling's getting better. But I'd like to hear maybe your sort of take from what we see. Breitling has a tendency to show up on gray market sellers. It's a 30, 40, 35+% off. And it definitely questions. I mean, I was looking at, the Super Ocean and going into an AD thinking like, if I buy this gray market, I'm getting 30% off, 25% off, something like that. So maybe speak to what they're doing to either change that, or they're continuing like that.
Well, so, you guys have been around long enough. Like me, I think the whole industry was shocked when Georges Kern, who was number 3 at the time at Richmond, resigned and suddenly showed up at Breitling. I was like, he went where? What? And it was a sad story about why Teddy Schneider had to sell the company, which I won't get into right now. But it was very sad why he had to sell. But anyway, I think Georges Kern is trying to, I don't want to say reinvent the brand, because that's not really true. He's really looking at their history to try and bring back the brand to its former glory, if you will. I'm not sure if it really had a glory. But I think that he's looking at the old catalogs, and he has said this publicly. He has said everything we need has already been done.
It's incredible history.
Yeah, so he's focused on bringing this stuff back. But my take on the brand right now, and I like Breitling very much, and I've sold them for many, many years. Again, this is very personal taste. I think the two-tone 44 millimeter chronomat is one of the best two-tone watches out there. A 500 meter watch that's really good looking watch for if you like two-tone. The pilot bracelet, I mean, it's a good beater. And the new 01 movement, not new anymore, it's 12 years old now, but the 01 movement's very robust. The thing is that Georges Kern, after running IWC, he knew that if we're going to really grow this brand, there's one market we have not tapped, and that was China.
Mm.
And China had saved in 2010 and 2011, China had saved Richmond and a whole bunch of people.
Oh, yeah.
And he knew Breitling had never been there. And so he said, man, we can keep our numbers in Europe and the US, but we need to expand into the Asian market. I think, when they came out suddenly with these, when they redesigned the Colts and they made the dial super clean, right? There was no more, didn't have any more engine turn on it, didn't have a lot of 24-hour writing. It was very clean.
Well, the scales.
And I kind of looked at it when it stroked my chin and said, I think I know exactly who you're targeting here. Because, the Chinese don't like busy. They like clean. They like classic. They like, simple. Now they've come out. They've just launched, they've the new Chronomats with the bullet bracelet again. And they brought these ladies pieces up. And they're very clean dials again. And they're nice. Now, from my history of selling the brand for 28 years, I do look at them and I think, they're nice. They're clean. They are a little bit boring. Like they've lost some. Before they had a little more in your face, like this is who we are. This big orange dial, this big yellow dial. We're going to put this stuff out. We don't really care what people think. This is who we are. And now it seems that they've kind of backed off a little bit and said, okay, what can we do to be all things to all people? And in their recent marketing, they've said, we are an all-inclusive brand. What they're trying to say is we are like Rolex and Omega. We have something for everybody. And in the past, that was not their feeling at all. It was like, hey, this is who we are, and jump in the lake if you don't like it.
I feel like definitely, maybe not so much with design. I think they're still, they're still doing orange stuff, but I think definitely from a standpoint of the options, like the Super Ocean 2 comes in 3 sizes, 14 colors, different strap. I mean, just like, it's like 80 options with like 65 part numbers. And you're like, okay, so I just want a Super Ocean 2. Like, so I feel from that standpoint, it's kind of like, well, all for everyone, one for everyone.
Yeah, they've toned down the Annie Digis as well, haven't they? I mean, I'm partial to a Breitling Annie Digi. I've got a Breitling B1 that I absolutely adore, and I've noticed they've completely toned them down. They've got the 2 emergencies and then the Avenger, is it? But the rest of those is toned down, and the sizes are getting more reasonable. I really like the Super Ocean, the way it's. But it's interesting what you said. It's definitely a lot cleaner dial with the oversized numbers, and I've definitely got my eye on one of those for sure.
Yeah, I think that. So before he took over, I went to Breitling in 2010, and they had released the 01, and they were getting ready to put it into Navitimers and Chronomats and all that. And I knew because every year they would release the chronometer figures, right? The COSC. And so every year we knew how many watches Breitling made. Basically, right? Okay, They did 156 last year. Okay, they did 120 this year. And when we were there, I said to them, I know that you guys made, about at this time, about 150,000 watches last year. But what's your goal? Now, this is 2010 or 2011. And at that time, Teddy Schneider said, our goal is 900. And I was like, whoa, really? So I realized that what they were trying to do is they were chasing Rolex. And they wouldn't say Omega, but their pricing was like Omega. Their ambition was Rolex,
I see.
And
yeah.
what I'm saying? So I think like Omega, they've become, I think in many respects, much more like Omega. Like they've become cleaner.
Right.
Yes, you have a bunch of different sizes, but it's cleaner. It's not fussy. The rider tabs don't pull your shirts anymore. They're lower profile and they're part of the bezel now. The Super Oceans, which I think the Super Ocean Heritage rubber strap, black dial with the rose gold, or the Beverly Hills one with the blue strap, blue dial, and the rose. I think it's a really good looking piece, very, very clean. Before they were very much a European and kind of an American European brand. Jet fighters, Top Gun, cool.
Right.
And they haven't let go of that, but they've basically said, kind of like the Moonwatch, like we'll never let go of this. We'll keep the emergency, we'll keep the aerospace, we'll keep the replacement to the B1 now. We'll keep these, but that'll be less and less and less and less. and we're going to introduce more and more this general public type of watch that everyone's going to like they would a Datejust.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You can always get a Navitimer, but here's what we have for your 200-meter dive, watch, that sport watch.
I think you'll eventually have guys who are like the purist, and they'll be like the Navitimer guys. And then everybody else and they'll be like the guys who are like the no date sub guys. And then you'll have the other guys who are like, yeah, a crown for every achievement. And I bought another chronomat.
Right.
This time it's steel.
So down in the U.S. Virgin Islands, you have no sales tax. You have so duty is free for $1,600.
That's cumulative upon party members.
Okay. So here's my take. My in-laws live in Oregon, and it's tax-free there, and I'm sure there's an Omega AD. But if I go up there and I buy, say, an X33 Skywalker for my, fun space watch, even though I have no sales tax, I'm still in Oregon with my in-laws. So sell us on going to the U.S. Virgin Islands and making a special trip to your store.
I think that's a fair question, and I'll preface it with this: my dad, salesman that he was, over the road salesman, right? His territory was the northeast quadrant of the U.S. He used to always tell me, listen, when everything's said and done, they don't have to buy from you. They can buy from anybody. They buy from you because they like you.
Right.
Yeah. That's the bottom. It's trust and all that relationship, But here's what I'll tell people. First off, people will ask me silly questions like, is this the best deal I'm going to find anywhere? And I tell them, look, you can always find somebody somewhere who can give you a better deal.
Right.
And if you're the guy who your brother-in-law gets you a watch at cost, and then you drive down the road, proud as can be, and see a store going out of business and it's 10 cents on the dial, and you kick yourself, you are not my customer, right? That's not, you're not the person I'm looking for. But some of the advantages we have, let's take Omega. They are going towards all boutique. They're not there yet. In the US, though, they do have a tighter hold on more and more retailers now. In the Caribbean, they have a standard Caribbean duty-free price of 15% off the US, no tax, which for me, coming from New York, where I was raised, that would be like about 22 to 23% off. Okay. Right. When everything's said and done, when it's all signed for. I tell people this: you're always going to get a good price. You're always going to get an extended warranty on top of that, which is just nice little peace of mind. You are always going to have the option with us of doing things like using our house account. The X33, I don't remember the retail right now, but if it's over $3,500, which is pretty much all Omega, you've got 18 months. There is zero interest. If it's over $6,000, it's 2 years. There's zero interest. So when you put zero interest, plus a duty-free price, plus no tax, plus a really pretty island.
Yeah, yeah.
St. Thomas is a beautiful place, and I won't share my screen with you right now, but I look out on 22 islands, and it's a pretty magical place. So when you put all those things together, you go, when everything's said and done and signed for, 9 times out of 10, you get it for less here. Not always, but you almost always have a great experience here.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I mean, just looking at the amount of brands that you guys carry, I mean, it's definitely, and I think Todd's hooked on the destination for sure.
Yeah, he can tell you more about it after he can do his review of our Airbnb, and then he can tell you about that.
Well, that's been really interesting. A final question, I think, before we conclude here. Knowing everything you know about all the brands, what do you personally gravitate to? Is it based on, does it change as you get to know more brands, or do you have your sort of core manufacturers that you think offer great value for money or that you personally enjoy?
For me personally, it depends on a couple of factors. It depends on the type of product I'm looking for. Like, is it going to be a sporty water type of watch, right, that I can wear everywhere and not have to worry about it? I tend to lean towards classic. I think as I've gotten a little bit older, I tend to look for like khakis, light blue button down, navy blazer, goes everywhere. And in watches, it's the same thing. It's not that it's milk toast. It's something that'll stand the test of time. Like I think Jaeger-LeCoultre's new master calendar, which is just a slight twist on an old design, was really quite ingenious. The date jumps from the 15th to the 16th and does not block the moon phase. And it does it in about a 5-second jump, which was pretty impressive because usually calendar watches like that take about an hour to go through each of the functions. But the design is classic. And I think that a watch like that in 50 years is still going to look awesome. I tend to stay away from things that I think are dated. Like, I'm not a big fan of like all black watches. I stay away from PVD like the plague.
Yeah.
Even though, people will talk about the tag Dark Lord and things like that, I just think that a lot of stuff like that looks a bit dated. And I think that, in 20 years, I'll think that was really cool back then, but, I've kind of moved on. So I look for the things that I think are going to have staying power. A good example would be like, and this is personal taste, I wouldn't buy the Planet Ocean with the orange segment because I think orange has got a pretty short shelf life. But the all black, sure, I'd buy that all the way. It's got a long shelf life. And so I look for me things like that, or things that are going to be unique, but that will stand the test of time. I think the Silver Snoopy is a very, very cool watch. Not that you're going to have to take off the watch every time you want to show somebody the spinning Earth and the lunar capsule going around the back of the watch. But no one's ever done anything like this, and it's going to be like the Jimi Hendrix of watches. It's the first time someone's done a regular plain manual wind round watch that had something really cool like that on the back. It's not a reverso. It's not Patek's, Grand Chime, Master Chime. It's something that's really cool with something on the back. And it, of course, makes you go, what else could you do like that, right? So I think it's going to pave the way, and I think it's going to stand the test of time. And I think the blue and the white are good, constant colors. I stay away from greens, personally. I hope no one shoots me for this. Like, I love Patek's 5168G001, the Aquanaut with the blue strap and blue dial. I detest the green one. I think the green one's hideous.
Yeah.
And I've had them on my wrist, and I said, even if you gave this to me, I probably wouldn't wear it because it's too military, it's too khaki. It's just not me, But that's the beauty of watches. To me, the beauty of watches is when people ask me what I do, I tell them I sell horological artwork, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder, And people come to me, and everyone's taste is a little bit different, and so I can tell people what I like and why I like it. But at the end of the day, you're going to gravitate towards what appeals to your eye. For me, it's the stuff that's classic, that's timeless, that I think I'm still going to like 30 years down the road. So that's me.
Dean, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode. That was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
As always, guys, we really appreciate you listening. If you've got any questions to ask, head on over to the Casual Watch Talk Facebook group. As always, we appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next time on Casual Watch Talk. Thanks, guys. Bye.